other for many years, so we might make fun of each other, but it's with much love.
This is really great company. Shayna, Margareta, and Lila. I feel like, you know, this is kind of like a friendship presentation in a way. So I'm sure you'll all feel that because we've known each other for years. Okay, so Confronting Anti-Gypsy Discrimination Canada. It's a new thing maybe for some people to hear about. Not too many people really know who we are. Next slide, please. So I did have the pleasure and the privilege of working with Harvard University. Canadian Romani Alliance was a community partner. And Shayna was also a part of the community partnership that helped to direct this project. And Magda from Harvard was really key in helping to coordinate the Canadian research as well as the academic portion of gathering and interpreting the research at Harvard. So I will share a little bit more about that in a bit. I'm just going to start to go on to the slides and just kind of give a little brief overview of who the Roma community is to begin with, because I feel like that always needs to be established when talking about our experiences in Canada. So do any of you know anything about the Romani community? Yes.
Just a little bit. I'm from Finland, and so there's quite a big population in Finland.
Okay, great. Anybody else? No?
I grew up in Latin America too, and so big influence.
A lot of Romani people in Latin America?
Part of the cultural discourse too, like mentioning literature. So 100 years of study.
That's great. I always learn new things. So often, I was born and raised in Toronto and moved here 10 years ago. And regardless of where I am, often even in my workspace with other teachers, people don't really know who we are, right? There's still that belief that maybe we are part of a subculture, right? That anybody could be Gypsy. So next slide, please. Here we go. So this idea that, right, that we're a subculture, that if you exhibit certain characteristics that are stereotypical of what people think about who gypsies are, that you too can be a gypsy, right? And that seems to be a big thing among Canadians, especially that are not European background and don't often have experience or knowledge about the Roma community. So it's always a challenge, right? To be able to share your identity when you don't know if people actually know that you exist. And then you have to be ready and prepared to provide an explanation and educate them, right? So that's kind of a bit of burden to carry. And so you'll learn from the report that in the key findings that one big thing about Canadian Roma is that we often don't intentionally hide. Some people intentionally hide, but many people conceal or choose not to reveal their Roma identity for some of those reasons. So you might be aware of some stereotypes that exist. So some of those include being a wanderer, being a traveler. Here we have Julia Lovell. Can we go back for 1 second? Sorry. So she was on the front of the Georgia Strait. I chose that because we're here on this land. And she worked with the National Film Board of Canada to create Opera Roma Gypsies in Canada, the first ever documentary about us. That was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the Georgia Strait decided to cover it in a way that was actually not welcomed by our community. As you can see, the big headline on the front is nomad's land. So everything we tried to accomplish within that documentary was almost erased, right, by this this heading in this article that just again brought us back to reinforcing those original stereotypes that we're trying to move away from. Okay, so moving on. Next slide, Shayna, thank you. A lot of people still think, you know, that we're all fortune tellers. Going to school, I experienced a lot of occasions where other kids in the school came dressed as gypsies, sometimes their parents. Sorry. So even parents and adults, and I mean, this is up until very recently, until there was more of this concerted effort when we started to talk about, you know, culture is not a costume, you know, and this really helped us because with the First Nations community, it was a big thing too, right? At Halloween, wearing the chief headdress, right? And so usually those were often placed beside each other in Halloween stores, right? Selling costumes, whereas the Gypsy chief and the Gypsy, or sorry, the First Nations chief and the Gypsy fortune teller. So this was an article in the Toronto Sun back when Gypsies a world apart. I remember growing up seeing a lot of this kind of stuff. So trying to move away from that stereotype. And again, this one, a lot of stereotypes of criminality, right? And that follows us constantly. This one here, the BBC documentary actually won an award for their documentary on featuring Roma children as Gypsy child thieves. And it was actually a human rights documentary, incredible that they were awarded something for that. My mother's siblings and grew up with Gypsies, Tramps and Thieves, this hugely popular song back in the day. And another example we have over here is Ezra Levant. I don't know if any of you know who he is. He used to be a host on Sun News. And I called the police and charged him with hate crime for willfully promoting hatred on Canadian television. So yeah, after he was faced with hate crime charges is when they issued an apology. And in that 8 minutes of him being live on air, he talked a lot about us being like a gang of criminals, like the Bloods and Crips, out to, you know, commit crime, and that we need an army of social workers to help rehabilitate us. So just some examples of what he shared. So this is more accurate of who we are. This is a public education project that we did with a collection of black and white portraits of Roma working in middle and professional class occupations in Canada. This is part of a larger portrait collection that exists of Roma all over Europe by a photographer named Chet Evans Wyatt. He's from America. And if you ever wanted to see more of these photographs about us from all different countries, and a large collection from Canada that exists now, that's located on romarising.com. So that project was really directly to counteract all of the negative and the romanticized Gypsy stereotypes that exist. So a little bit more about who we really are. We're a group of people that have a common ancestry, a language, and a culture. We're incredibly diverse, different religions, depending on where we may have settled in Europe, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. There's approximately 15 million Roma. We're the largest minority in Europe, and we're dispersed all throughout the world. In Canada, there's approximately 140,000 of us, with the largest concentration in Toronto, which is actually the largest Roma population concentration outside of Europe. Thank you. So this is a little bit of a demographic breakdown of our population in Europe. But we do have populations throughout the whole world. But the big concentration is in Central Europe and the Balkans. I think Hungary, where my family's from, there's approximately 1 million Roma there. Romania, there's 2 million Roma. Some of our origins, not a lot of people know that we're part of actually the Indian diaspora with roots going back centuries. And we were part of a long migration to Europe and had arrived somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries. There's different documentation of us coming into Europe at that time. This is our Romani flag. Sorry, Shayna. Dun, dun, dun. Roma flag. This was gifted to us by the Indian government in 1971 when we were officially recognized as an ethnic group with a diasporic connections to India. So this is, we celebrate International Roma Day, which unites us all around the world on April 8th. So it was April 8th, 1971 that we were recognized as a group of people that have a common origin. We'll move to the next slide, Shayna. Our history in Europe has not been one that has been good for us. There's been a number of genocides from the time we came into Europe, but the most well-known one, which is often still left out, is the Roma genocide during the Holocaust. Estimates go anywhere from 250,000 to 1.5 million, depending on which site you're looking at. Roma people ourselves, we put the estimate a little bit higher because many people were killed in large fields and places that were in rural areas and buried in mass graves that are still being uncovered today as burial sites. So one of the big things that we're trying to do is get recognition, this being education, right? We're trying to advocate with the Ministry of Education in British Columbia to make sure we're included in curriculum elaborations when teaching about World War II and the Holocaust. This is a film that was made by Canadian Jewish filmmakers based out of Toronto. It was the first and only film that documents the story about Roma during the Holocaust and has interviews with Roma Holocaust survivors. And that's called The People Uncounted.
Hi, everybody. I think it's, am I right, Gina?
Yes, it's Shayna's turn.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Shayna Plaut. And Lilach read some of my ridiculously long novel. The reason why I'm part of this conversation, though, today, I am not Roma. I'm Jewish. I often joke around and I say I'm from that other group of people that nobody likes in Europe. But I have had the really the pleasure of and fairly unique experience in some ways of working with not on Roma rights and Roma self-representation and self-representation in claiming of rights and in being able to present oneself through journalism, through film, through advocacy. And so I speak Romani. I'm not Roma. Most of the work that I did and continue to do is with Roma in Hungary and in primarily though in Macedonia. It's now North Macedonia, Kosovo, and other parts of the Balkans. So my part here is actually to try and explain, like, wait a minute, I thought that Roma are in Europe and now they're over here. What's going on? How did this actually happen? And also to provide a bit of a human rights context in terms of that stuff. So are we good? I know we're over time. Are people okay? Can somebody say, like, yes, I'm breathing? I need it from the room. We're good? All right, okay. So one of the main stereotypes, as Gina was explaining, was that Roma are peripatetic or Roma are nomadic. And there's a difference between being, first of all, recognizing that there are many populations in Europe who were peripatetic, who were nomadic, who would follow that of their craft, of their livelihood. So I think that there was a person in the class who said that they were from Finland. I know I worked a lot with the Sami people, Sami folks, some of them who are following the reindeer, they're going to be peripatetic people who are traders, not traders like I'm stabbing you in the back, but traders, merchants. They're going to go where the work is. People who have a craft, who have that kind of a skill, sharpening knives, working with metal. Again, they're going to go where the craft is. So Roma are not the only group of folks in Europe who were peripatetic. Also, Roma were throughout most of Europe were banned from owning land and being farmers, which in some ways was seen as the most esteemed, quote unquote, respectable profession in a lot of ways. So similar to the Jewish population in Europe, there in many places you were not allowed to own land. So then once again, you're going to be going into professions and livelihoods that will take you. You will go where the work is. And then lastly, Roma were often chased out. And we're not allowed to stay in certain places. This is still happening every day in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, where Roma are not allowed to stay in one place and therefore are forced to move. So it's really interesting when we talk about, oh, Roma are travelers, Roma are nomadic, versus Roma were excluded from being able to be in professions that enabled you to stay in place, or were forced to move, or were one of many populations that were moving. Now, this was the case in many parts of Europe before communism. During communism, Roma became part of the proletariat. So in the work and that I've done, and places that I spent in Hungary and former Yugoslavia, so former socialist countries, I have never met uh, populations that were so nostalgic in some ways for the stability of socialism. Recognizing that there was political persecution, but also recognizing that there was a stability uh, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of housing, and in terms of being part of a greater population, which is that of the proletariat. At the same time, there was also a forced homogenization of people. So many of the things, cultural rights, social rights that all human beings should enjoy were washed out because of socialism and communism. And again, how that was experienced in different places. So Magda, from the experience in Romania is going to be different than, for instance, the experience of folks in Hungary, or different from the experience of folks in Yugoslavia. After the fall of communism, after the fall of socialism, I'm using those words interchangeably, but they're not. They're the rise of rapid urban and rapid capitalism, unbridled capitalism, just exposed what were already very, very deep socioeconomic fissures. And the protection that socialism had given in terms of ensuring basic human rights, basic living standards, was no longer there. That of housing, that of healthcare, that of education. Also, the safety that could be there in state-based work and public work was no longer there. So what you saw was rapid disparity growing, particularly actually in the private sector, where there was much a lack of protections. Gina already spoke a lot about some of the various human rights abuses, and you may have seen me kind of shake my hand about the numbers, about, how many numbers are there. And, I think about Mark Twain, there's lies, there's damn lies, there's statistics. The truth of the matter is I cannot find a number more recent than 2008 about the number of Roma people in Europe. So it still often says 10 to 12 million Roma in the world, 8 million of them in Europe. Literally, the numbers, you cannot find more updated information, which in and of itself points to discrimination, right? In and of itself, it's that lack of attention points to a problem. Other human rights abuses that took place that aren't talked about as much as the forced sterilization campaigns that took place most recently in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but also in Denmark and Netherlands. Roma are living in Western Europe, have lived in Western Europe for a really long time. Again, the colleague of yours in Finland, was speaking about that. And then there also was the migration of Roma from Central Eastern Europe into other European countries. Some of the systemic violations of human rights that you can see here in terms of health, education, housing, so socioeconomic rights, but also that of physical safety, right to assembly, right to be able to have that safety, and a lack of police protection and redress. And what we've also seen most recently is that the freedom of movement has been abridged as well. Roma in Europe are often part of the Schengen visa zone, right? So Roma should, like all other Europeans, be able to go to other countries in the Schengen visa zone. But what we'll see is that there's actually racially based discrimination that often prohibits that, especially in countries like France and Spain and the UK prior to Brexit. Other things, I'm actually going to go over here. there's been a significant uptick in the violence against Roma since 2008. Um, and this is seen in parallel with the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarian democratic totalitarian regimes in Europe. So yes, there is democracy in Europe, but at the same time, that democracy is voting in um, nationalism, it's voting in populism, it's voting in an idea of us, and the only way that you have the idea of us is if you have the idea of them, right? And this is something that Magda I know will speak about a little bit later, just the basic tenets of Orientalism. In order to know who you are, you have to not be them. And Roma have traditionally and historically and currently been quote unquote the them in Europe, as well as in some aspects with Jews. But what we can see is this language of referring to Roma as vermin, mosquitoes, undesirables. Again, this is France, this is Hungary, this is the UK, Slovakia, so Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe as well, and then sometimes it's escalating into murder. One thing I really want to just kind of bring the home is that there is no right to leave one's home because of racism. There's no right to leave one's home because of prejudice. But there is a right to seek safety. And this is a non-derogable right. This is a right that cannot be taken away. So there is a right to seek safety because of persecution based on race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, or being a member of a social group, which is often interpreted as that of sexuality, gender, ability, disability. And there has been a dramatic change since the fall of socialism and the rise of the EU in um, asylum-based cases for people who are Roma who are being persecuted on the base of their race, their ethnicity, and being a member of a social group. And this right has not been recognized here in Canada. I will now turn it over. And if you want to know more about this, you can read in Media Mirrors, which I think Lilach you gave to the students already. Is that correct?
Which one, the newest piece?
The Media Mirrors, the one that I wrote with Victor and
Yes, I shared, I put it on campus. You wanna just share what this graph is though, Shayna?
no, not right now. I'm going to turn it over to Magda to keep it on time. We can go back to that.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, or rather, good evening from Boston. It's such a great pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'm thrilled to engage in this conversation with Shayna and Gina, Lila, and I see Ildi on the screen, Francis, and others. So I'm very excited about this. I will address 2 points in my short presentation. First, I will discuss the study that Gina, our teams, and I conducted in Canada. And second, I will draw a few parallels between our research findings in Canada and our research findings in another project in the United States. But perhaps to begin, I would like to provide some context about the broader mission of the Roma program at Harvard. Basically, in 2012, we laid the groundwork for the Roma program, which aims to examine past and present discrimination, exclusion, and inequities, basically the continuities of all this, and examine broadly anti-Roma racism or anti-Romaness as a global phenomenon. Our goal has never been to duplicate existing research, especially in Europe, where the field of Romani study has flourished quite a lot in the past decades. But instead, we have focused on collecting new data developing new and more participatory methodologies and trying to spotlight and amplify the voices of Roma scholars, activists, organizations, leaders, and so on. So our program really goes beyond research. We mentor students and support international fellows, particularly Romani students from Europe. And we also try to create spaces for dialogue through events like our annual Roma conference at Harvard in April every year, which is an event that marks International Roma Day. And Gina talked about that for a bit. Now, when it comes to research, my approach to examining anti-Roma racism aims to really explore this complex, if you want, interconnected nature of various levels, layers, manifestations of racism. And I think that very much of it builds on my own experience as an Roma person in a Roma community, but also as an activist that has worked in various Roma communities and neighborhoods. And I've seen quite a few forms of discrimination, and very often we can see this interconnection between interpersonal and institutional racism, historical and present day manifestations of racism, and so much more. But in designing this project titled Confronting Major and Everyday Discrimination, Romani Experiences in Canada's Greater Toronto Hamilton area, we, meaning Harvard and our partner, the Canadian Romani Alliance, once again, thank you, Gina, for this beautiful partnership and friendship. We essentially had two rationales, or two additional rationales to my whole research on, on these complexities of anti-Roma racism. The first one is that there is very little quantitative and qualitative research and data collected about Romani Canadians, particularly Roma-led research. And the second is that many of the existing surveys about the global Roma diaspora hint at Roma individuals often underreporting experiences of discrimination. And I would say that one reason, perhaps amongst many others, is that both scholars and respondents view discrimination solely through the lens of legal definitions. And Shayna, you can talk a little bit more about it here from the perspective of individual rights versus collective injustices and how we can approach that. And thus, mostly we think in Europe about discrimination as a violation of human rights or as social exclusion. So as a result, we often fail to measure the actual extent of this painful and multifaceted Roma experience with discrimination, not only in Europe, but also in the United States, Canada, Latin America, and beyond. So our primary research question for this study was very basic. Namely, what are the experiences faced by Romani people in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area regarding major and everyday discrimination? And in addition, we wanted to learn a little bit about non-Romani Canadians' awareness and perception of these realities. So we use primarily semi-structured interviews with Romani Canadians of various European backgrounds, but also non-Romani Canadians. Thus, this study is qualitative, and our findings cannot really be generalized to the Canadian Romani populations or the global Romani population. Our study was built upon the theoretical and analytical frameworks established by two prominent scholars. The first framework focuses on stigma, and it was developed by Michel Lamont, a Canadian sociologist. And the second framework on the right side of my screen, I assume is the same for you, which addresses everyday and major discrimination, was developed by Jamaican American social scientist David Williams. These frameworks, I would argue, have been very instrumental in uncovering experiences of discrimination that would otherwise remain unrecognized and unreported in different parts of the world. So for instance, Michel Lamont studied stigmatization in Brazil, the United States, and Israel, and David Williams has developed a whole scale of actually measuring both major and everyday discrimination. But Lamont defines stigmatization as a subjective experience of facing stereotypes or aggressions that may appear to be small or microaggressions, but they hold a lot of weight, and they come with a lot of pain, but they are still hard to be identified as discriminatory acts because they are not very overt. Yes, they have the power not only to impact health and well-being, but also a sense of self and the sense of worth. And the Romani people who are here and have, an experience of that know what I'm talking about. And in turn, Williams uses this concept of everyday discrimination to measure also daily experiences of unfair treatment. And he talks about moments when someone is treated with less respect or courtesy, or experiences when someone uses misguided comments. But I think that if we were to look at these two concepts, we can see that there are a lot of similarities between them. They both focus on subjective experiences of the way that you feel about these issues, but they measure slightly different issues, if you want, and I'll explain it in a bit. So if you were to bring this theoretical framework back to our study, while we were building on the work of these two prominent scholars in analyzing the experiences of Romani American Canadians, we developed a thematic coding system that is inclusive of the very specific experiences of Romani Americans to measure everyday discrimination. So we didn't just borrow their frameworks, we actually adjusted and reframe it for our own purposes. And to mitigate potential biases in the ways in which we coded everyday discrimination, basically every member of our team independently confirmed some thematic coding in this decision-making process. And I'll just highlight a few codes to walk you through how we approach the data and show you a few examples of the codes that meet a criteria for coding. For example, experiences or statements were classified as ethno-racial insults. You see on the screen the first example. If they involved explicitly ethno-racially motivated comments intended to harm or demean. Then instances that involved projecting misinformed or uninformed views, particularly negative or romanticized stereotypes of a Romani individual's character, were classified as misunderstood, as you can see on the screen. We also organized our data to assess two distinct forms of aversion: a more passive form of distancing and more active form of distancing. Essentially, we came up with 9 codes adjusted to Romani Canadians' realities, which you can see on the screen. And basically, the findings of our study look at each of these experiences and analyze and show some examples. When it comes to major discrimination, or we can think about it as human rights violations that are more overt. We use 3 code groups, namely resources and service denial, differential treatment, and ethno-racially profiled. And Shayna talk about police abuse and evictions and all the forms of discrimination that you can imagine in Europe, but we see such forms of discrimination also in Canada. And finally, we coded Romani Canadians' responses to everyday and major discrimination into identity repression and relativistic minimization. And Gina alluded to the fact that many people, including in Canada, would hide or conceal their identity in certain circumstances. I will refer to some of these findings in my second part of this presentation, which will only take about 5 minutes, but and Gina will talk about more about the findings in her next presentation. But I want to say that in summary, we found that the overwhelming majority of Romani respondents experience at least one act of everyday discrimination in Canada. And the Romani respondents were more likely to report incidents of feeling or being misunderstood. And this is related to this whole idea of gypsiness and what does it mean to be a gypsy. So then we are talking about a lack of awareness about the existence of Romani people and the enduring tropes related to Romani experiences. But we also found that Romani women experience gendered indignities or gendered racialization, particularly in instances when Gajikane men, I'm talking about non-Roma men, objectify their bodies in many circumstances, and we detail that in the study. And then when it comes to experiences of major discrimination, as you can see in table 4, it was interesting that we basically found that more Romani Canadians reported that they had experienced discrimination than those who reported that discrimination exists in Canada when it comes to Romani people. So they themselves experienced it, but they thought that this is not an issue in Canada because that's more a matter that happens in Europe. So then other Romani Canadians may not have had a similar experience with them. But importantly, and this is back to Shayna's point about institutional racism in Europe, in Canada too, what we see is that the acts of major discrimination that were reported were most likely executed by state representatives. So we are talking about institutional racism. Now, briefly, the organizers have asked me to talk about similarities and differences in anti-Roma discrimination or anti-Roma racism in Canada and the United States. And I will use these 2 studies, the 2024 study in Canada and another 2020 study in the US that we implemented alongside Voice of Roma, a Roma-led organization based in California. And I want to give you a little bit of background in terms of my understanding of racism. I don't see it from the lenses of the liberal theory of racism as a system that is rooted in prejudice and ideology and beliefs, but I see it more from the structural perspective of racism, or the radical theory of racism developed in Suriname, Trinidad, and Martinique. So I see prejudice and ideology as justifications of racism, not as roots of racism. But that being said, I will give you a few examples of commonalities in the US and Canada. For instance, both in Canada and the United States, we asked the Romani participants about their preferred ethno-racial identity terminology. And as you can see on the screen, both in Toronto, and in the United States, the majority of our interviewees prefer the terms Roma or Romani, as opposed to Gypsy or other variations of those. When we asked about insults or slurs, thinking about this concept of everyday discrimination, 68% of Romani participants in the United States reported being insulted or being called names because of their identity. In Canada, you can see the background of these specific experiences with everyday discrimination, and the pieces of everyday discrimination in this table marked as table 2, but the daily experience with discrimination would include racial slurs, insults, and ethno-racial jokes. And I think that when it comes to, ethno-racial jokes, many of us sometimes accept them and find them funny. But if you were to look at the study that Michel Lamont implemented in the US, Brazil, and Israel, we can see that they actually have an impact on people as well. And then we also asked interviewees about portrayal in the media, and you've talked about this. Gina has already touched upon that, and I think there is a broader conversation about representation of Romani people in culture and arts. I think that one of the participants in the room mentioned Garcia Marquez and 100 Years of Solitude. I think that's probably one of the least detrimental pieces, but there is so much more literature that is very detrimental to Roma people, and both Roma people in Canada and the United States know that. So they are very much aware that this is detrimental. And then finally, and this is my last slide, we also asked the Romani respondents in these 2 countries about their response to discrimination and racism. So what do they do? And we can see that 70% of Romani individuals in the US hide their identity when they are in interactions with non-Roma people to avoid stigmatization. And in the same table number 2 on the screen, if you go down to the bottom, we can see also that Romani Canadians in Toronto also use identity repression as a tool to defend themselves from discrimination and racism. Now I'll stop here and pass the floor back to Gina and Shayna.
Thank you, Magda. That was very insightful to go into some of the details of the study. So we'll just make this a little bit bigger. So it was a really exciting opportunity to be invited.
Wait, hold on. I'm sorry. I want to get the PowerPoint the right way. Can someone please tell me if this is correct slide?
You don't say it yet.
I know.
It has the paper.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Is it correct?
Yes. Thank you.
Yay. Okay.
Okay. So, because no research has ever been done like this in Canada, it was the first time that we had this opportunity to look into this and do this with our community. So, I mean, really, it was a landmark opportunity to engage in this report. And so, I mean, first it was putting together a team, right? And for me, it had to be a team of Romani field researchers. I did not. We have one non-Roma that helped with doing the interviews with non-Roma participants. So in the end, we had 20 non-Roma. And so I felt like it was a bit of definitely a conflict and a safety issue having someone that's Romani interview people that are non-Roma about discrimination towards the community. So that was my rationale behind including somebody that was a very strong ally of our community to do the research with non-Roma. And then we had 80 Roma participants that were interviewed almost exclusively by a Roma field researcher. So this is a huge accomplishment for us as a community, even because people have written so much about us. People have done so much studying about us and reporting on us, but us being able to have the power to tell our own story and to engage with our own community and represent ourselves the way we feel most comfortable, it's a huge shift, right? And it's happening in many different ways. I mean, the Roma rights movement has really flourished in the last 25 years, right? Where we're finally like having a voice and amplifying our stories and experiences. So can you go back just 1 second, Shayna, please? Even for us, it was a challenge of putting together this poster over here of encouraging people to come talk to us. Like, how do we make people feel safe to come and share their experiences? Because there's so much intergenerational trauma in our community. There's so much people trying to distance themselves from their identity here in Canada, where people feel they're more easy to blend and live a safer, less, you know, human rights violating life if you could just blend in with all the other beautiful people in this mosaic that we live within, right? So this poster in itself was a challenge, and I went back and forth a lot of how we're going to encourage people to participate. And in the end, this is what we decided on, of encouraging people to come forward if you've ever felt rejected, discriminated against, misrepresented, in danger, or hated. Next, please. So some of our findings, just to build on what Magda has already shared, for the non-Roma interviewees that participated, there was an enormous lack of awareness. But we knew that. We had already theorized that was going to happen, because that's our everyday lived experience. But this was just now a little bit more of evidence of it. Generally, non-European background Canadians don't know that we even exist, or what they know of is that there's a lot of stereotypes, the stuff that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. A lot of those stereotypes are romanticized, fetishized ideas of what it is to be a gypsy. And some of you might be wondering, well, where did this word gypsy come from if you refer to yourself as Roma or Romani, right? So Roma being more of a noun, Romani being a little bit more of an adjective. And this mistaken belief that we were Egyptians when we came into Europe, at a time when Coptic Christian Egyptians were leaving Egypt and coming into Europe, that's who we were mistaken as, hence the variation of that word into gypsy. Romani, or Roma, comes from our language, Romanes, and it means the people. So it's a way that we're trying to reclaim our own identity, very similar to when we talk about First Nations people and the word Indian, right? This mistaken belief of who you are, and then this label that's applied for centuries. And there's so many among us that refer to ourselves as gypsy, especially those in English-speaking parts of the world. So gypsy is what my family used to, and still continues to call themselves. Just because it's been for so many generations, and introducing the word Roma is still new to my family, who's been in the country since 1956, right? And you find also a lot of Roma in the UK still use the word gypsy, but in places like Hungary, where my family's from, you don't hear the word gypsy. You hear other things like Sigan, right? Which has a lot of negative terminology and comes from a Greek word astikani, which means untouchable. So there's very derogatory words that were labeled as throughout Europe often. And so gypsy is really an English word. It's not something that's experienced by Roma before they come to Canada often. Okay, so with our interviewees, definitely noticed a lot of people conceal their identity. And that's how they feel most comfortable. Either their parents taught them to do that back in Europe, or when they came to Canada, they didn't tell their children what their background is. They would say Slovak, or they would say Czech, or Yugoslavian, or Hungarian, but not add on the Romani part. So kind of divorcing that part of their identity when coming to Canada often. People feeling, again, the burden to educate others, and as another reason to conceal identity. A lot of the imported negative stereotypes are what people experience. So how do those show up? Those show up in the employment. Everyday employment, people that have worked in different jobs for their livelihood. If their boss was European background and found out that they were Roma, they would experience a lot of discrimination. Where there's a larger concentration of the community in parts of Toronto, people had a lot of difficulty finding housing. A huge problem has been in translation and interpretation for the newcomers. A lot of translators and interpreters are not Romani, right? And so when doing the interpretation in very important times in people's lives, for example, an immigration hearing, a medical meeting, talking with schools, that bias almost always came through. And I mean, I have direct experience working with as the executive director of the Roma community in Toronto for a number of years, of where we had to really deal with this a lot. And I mean, it led to a lot of terrible things, including people losing their asylum claims because of horrible legal representation, interpretation, and very biased and prejudiced views of people that are on immigration refugee board tribunals. And that was more of an example of like larger discrimination. So I will go through a couple slides with you, just to give you some of the examples that we see in the Canadian context. So here was someone that participated in our study, had come to Canada as a refugee claimant. And in Toronto, many people were housed in these motels because there wasn't enough shelters for refugees. So in one of these hotels, well, it was a whole strip of hotels, motels. And this was a neo-Nazi group deciding to come protest in front of the motels when they found out that there was Roma refugee claimants being housed there. And so they had signs like "Honk if you hate gypsies," "Canada's not a trash can." And we were able to respond to this only with the help of the Canadian Jewish community and someone named Bernie Farber, who was once the director of the Canadian Jewish Congress. They helped us with obtaining legal help, brought these people to court, and eventually they were found guilty of promoting hatred. So this is one person that participated in this study. He was in one of these motels when this was happening, and he told me how scared he felt. He didn't think that this existed in Canada. He thought this was something he only would experience in Europe. Okay, so there's the examples of individual discrimination and everyday discrimination. I find that many of the people that we interviewed that were European born and experienced the very overt type of discrimination that happens in Europe, they weren't able to fully grasp the everyday microaggressions that I've experienced. And many Roma born in Canada and are aware of like what these microaggressions look like as they show up, whether it's a funny joke of, "Oh, I better hide my wallet," or one day when I was meeting the Hungarian ambassador to Canada, the president of the Hungarian Cultural Center in Toronto asked me very casually, "Why are there so many gypsies in jail in Europe?" Like these kind of microaggressions, right, are something that many of us have encountered at different times. But it was obvious that some of these microaggressions, they weren't showing up for some of the Roma interviewees because they were used to such a more overt and aggressive type of discrimination that they didn't really see like the everyday stuff as detrimental or able to point to it as easily as the big acts of discrimination. So one thing that has been a big thing that many of us experience, whether we're Canadian born and we've been here for 100 years or 50 years or 20 years, or we've just arrived, was really this horrible discrimination towards people that are Roma that come to Canada and seek asylum. This idea of Europe being a safe, democratic, continent where human rights prevail everywhere, has been something that people that don't know our experience in Europe with ongoing human rights violations for decades, centuries. It's easy for them to point to, well, there's no reason to leave Europe for discrimination and persecution. But, in an attempt to keep Roma out of Canada for political reasons, that had a lot to do with the different countries becoming a part of the EU, that had to do with Canada and Europe Free Trade Agreement, that had to do with diplomatic relations. It didn't look good that Canada was accepting so many refugees from Europe. So this is, thank you, Shayna, a little bit of a graph of what happened when then Immigration Minister Jason Kenney started saying bogus refugees every time he was in an interview. In fact, we invited him to the Roma Community Center in Toronto and had a huge roundtable discussion with him and the people from the immigration department and immigration policymakers. We had Roma refugee claimants that had just had a huge experience with white supremacy in Hungary and white supremacists overtaking an entire village where the Red Cross had to come in and evacuate the Roma from the village because of how they were under attack in 2012. He heard firsthand from these people in the room in Toronto, and he still left the room saying Roma are bogus refugees. And so I really felt like this is not something that just any community in Canada would experience. There's very few that you can go after with such harsh and overt discrimination. And I called this fanning the flames of gypsy fiction. It was easy to get Canadians to believe and support what the government was saying. If you believe in those negative gypsy stereotypes that we're criminals, we're wanderers, you know, we take advantage of healthcare and welfare. I mean, that was what our government was overtly saying. And so at one point, I mean, you can see some very high acceptance rates. The average acceptance rate in Canada between 1996 and 2010 is the red line. The green line is the acceptance for Czech acceptance rate, and the orange one is for Hungarian. So you can see massive fluctuations in these acceptance rates. And you can see how, you know, at one point when Czech and Hungarian Roma were coming in 2008, 9 and 10, there was like an 80+ acceptance rate until the immigration minister started saying that these are bogus refugees, and it dropped to 0, and it remained at 0 for 4 straight months before it climbed up to be anywhere between 8 and 20%. And it wasn't, so you could go to the next slide, Shayna. It wasn't until
You know, just mindful of the time.
Yes.
Question.
Yes, I'm gonna finish up quickly. So here are some of, you know, how people have felt. This is a Hungarian Roma artist who drew this mural that was entitled Welcome to Canada. And another one says, get out of here, other says, go home. So this is a Hungarian like neo-Nazi boot, the other one is an immigration boot. Right, and this was the experience that people have felt. And, you know, even though we are long-term Canadians, many of us, of course, we feel for our newcomer community being treated like this. And I mean, and it bleeds into all of our lives, because then, you know, we all experience it. So some of the ways that we've been able to respond is through holding public presentations like this one at OISE, protesting in front of the Immigration Refugee Board, more protesting and demonstrating and working with allies like No One Is Illegal to help amplify our voices. In Vancouver here, they held a huge, the Vancouver Roma community held a huge protest and demonstration in front of the immigration offices downtown. At the same time, we worked with so many people on a redress on some of these different things. I mean, in schools, we talk a lot about communities that have faced institutionalized discrimination from our government over the years, whether it's the First Nations and Indigenous community, the Indian community and the Komokatu Maru, the Chinese head tax. But the discrimination towards Roma refugees in Canada is something that, you know, is right up there alongside those other ones that were appalling as well, you know. And perhaps one day our stories will be included in a larger context where people will learn and teach about it, even of what can happen when communities are targeted for discrimination from our government. I wish I could go into more about the redress and the people that worked on the redress with me. We never got an apology, but we did get a little bit of justice for some of the refugee claimants, even with having the lawyers, some of them disbarred and fined, and for what they did to completely sabotage things. And again, many of them were Hungarian Canadian lawyers. Okay, next.
And we'll have time for that in the question and answer
Okay.
period, right, Gina?
Yeah, we're getting there.
We got.
Yeah. Okay, some more stuff about our perseverance and our resilience, right? Yes, we've been targeted, but we're strong and we come back and we respond as best we can with the people that care about us. Are working in allyship. We have Hungarian Roma refugee, once upon a time, now a winner of Juno Awards for jazz in Canada, winning a lot of awards at jazz festivals throughout the country. He did the soundtrack for People Uncounted, the film about Roma during the Holocaust. The Canadian government finally recognized the genocide of the Roma in 2019. So got to push for people to teach about it too, to know our experience. So that was a big triumph. Some books about us where we write about our own story or people that work closely with us. Professors Cynthia Levine-Rasky, she spent years volunteering at the Roma Community Center with us. So she's had an opportunity to really help tell our stories. So there's a lot that has happened. It's hard to share in a short period of time, but this report that we did with Harvard, it really gives us an opportunity to open the door to have these conversations more and for people to really start to think about us as a community and our experiences. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, questions?
I'm curious, as you went through the interview process with the 80 Roma people, did you witness a reclaiming of identity through their participation?
Oh God, it's such a great question. Oh, there was tears, there was laughter. I mean, it was like these interviews went way longer than scheduled often because you can't rush these stories, right? Yeah, there was just that feeling of a shared similar experience that yes, many of us hide who we are now and talking about it with others, right? I mean, it helps to bring a sense of healing, of like acknowledging our experience here in this country, but acknowledging what's also happened in the past. So there was a lot of, some people that contacted us, believe it or not, they lived in, they've never really had much experience with meeting other Roma in Canada, and they really wanted to be able to share their experience. And just even talking to one of us as an interviewer, there was that feeling of like someone can relate to me and hear my story. And we really talked about, they want to help participate and build the Canadian Romani Alliance, and they want to find ways to give back to the community in the future.
Thank you, that's so powerful.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions. I really enjoy it, and it has helped me rethink so many things in a different way. So I'm from Central America, from Guatemala, and testimonio is very important, testimony. And so I'm wondering if there is any books that we can read about from the perspective of a person in Canada. That would be very nice. And then the other part, I also am a bit with or political organizing, and for me it was struck how it seems that the community organized fast, like that it comes like a second nature. And so I don't know if there is like a culture of organizing in a organic way and so on, because other communities are not prone to politicize like they represent. So maybe it's my own perspective, but is there anything there in the culture that
That's a great question. I mean, I think that all of us could respond to that a little bit. I'll just share that, for us, all of our Roma community in Canada, I mean, all of our organizations are volunteer based, right? I mean, any money that we get, any funding is like project-based funding. It's like, it has a beginning and an end. And so our work in fighting discrimination and responding to institutionalized discrimination is definitely been is volunteer work from our community. And so, because most of the people that participate, in our demonstrations and stand in solidarity from our community are more newcomers than the long-term Roma. The Roma that have been here for many, many years, you don't see them coming and helping out at the Roma Community Center or the Canadian Romani Alliance. They want to blend and they don't want to deal with the issues, right? And usually it's our newcomers that have come within the last 20 years that are willing to stand on the front lines with us because they have more experience, I think, of what it feels like in Europe, right? And what happens when you don't stand up for your rights. So I think that we're so used to having to like push back against discrimination, whether it's individual or institutional, that, you know, when it's time to come together and to support our community, especially when it comes to families looking for better lives that are safer and for their children, you know, we stand with them. Stand with them, and we find allies that are doing the same social justice work, and they will stand with us. And so it's the allyship that helps to amplify us and support us. I mean, so much I've participated in, I would not have been able to do that without support from like the Canadian Council for Refugees. For example, you know, like that kind of allyship with like immigration refugee leaders from organizations throughout the country. I mean, that kind of stuff. You know, when people see injustice, there's a great human rights community in Canada, I have to say. Like, we know how to stand up and fight for social justice. And when there's a community that is very vulnerable and marginalized and doesn't have resources, people, you know, help to support them and lift them up, right? So, I mean, even the opportunities I had to testify in front of the Canadian government about this discrimination, those would never have happened without support from like the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers. We even had a new group that formed, which was the Jewish Refugee Action Network, which was, you know, people were like, they understood our experience, they knew we needed support, and, you know, they started to rally around us.
Shayna, I have a question there, yeah.
Yeah, I just I want to respond to this in two ways, and then Magda, I don't know if you would be interested in just sharing your experience in terms of more of the activism in Europe, you know, as well. One is just in terms of recognizing, and I think that this is one of the most important things in the research, is that Roma in Canada, and it's funny, I know Voice of Roma very well, and Shawnee and everybody, you know, the world is small, right? You know, but you know, Roma in Canada, and Roma in the United States, there are multiple identities going on there, right? It's like you are Canadian, you are American, you know, I'm speaking for both, but you also may be a refugee or a refugee claimant, or you also may be a child of a refugee or and stuff like that. And you also may be an activist, and you also may be a student, right? So I would be careful in terms of essentializing a culture at any time. You know, but what I would say is recognizing that folks are taught, folks do drink the water of where they are, including the water of, okay, now I am safe to resist. Now I am safe enough to stand up. Which, you know, you can see that over and over again, that when folks are provided with their basic human rights, with the basic needs, their basic needs, then there can be enough space to then be able to protest. Or when people are so desperate and there's nothing left to lose, then there's that space to protest, right? It tends to be those two extremes. And in terms of any writing that's coming, I'm just going to give a plug. You know, there's a piece that's coming out on the human rights website, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights website, written by Gina, and it's actually called "We Are Roma, Neither Halloween Costume Nor Bogus Refugee." That's specifically looking at what's happening here in you know, with Roma in Canada. One other point I just want to kind of go back on you know, is that there's a social practice of human rights, and there's also a social practice of human rights violations, and it's something that Magda, I think, really touched on well. You know, we can look at things in terms of individual, you know, individual rights or individual rights violations, but there's also the collective rights, the experiencing of rights, as well as the collective rights of the experiencing of human rights violations in that sense. And I think that that's really important, because what Gina is talking about here is that people were collectively engaging in human rights practice.
Thank you, and I say, I don't know, Magda, if you want to add, and I see then 2 questions on the Zoom.
No, I rather give the floor to Ildi and Jessica. I want to
Okay.
hear.
Go for it.
Hi, my name is Yojika. I am a a refugee here in Toronto, and I just wanted to add more of a comment than a question, is that a lot of Roma has double identities. They are also identify as Hungarians, or I mean, I can only speak for the Hungarian Roma community, but a lot of these places, like the Hungarian community has a lot of cultural centers, churches, schools, and a lot of Roma are not really welcome there. They are they are made feel like how Gina said, like the comment that the president of the cultural house said, that why are so many gypsies are in jail. Sometimes they say like straight away things like that, or they just make you feel like you are not welcome, like and that has been really I know that has been really an awful experience to a lot of Hungarian Roma as well, that they want to celebrate Hungarian national holidays. They want to be part of, they want to enrich their Hungarian identity by attending these events or exchanging with Hungarians, but they are not welcome. And I know that mentally that has been challenging for me, for my family, and the vast majority of the Hungarian Roma community, because a lot of the Hungarian Roma community doesn't speak Romanes, they speak Hungarian. So a lot of times they want to attend a church or a cultural event, but they are not very welcome. So it's like they can't really celebrate their culture.
Thank you.
Just one thing to add on to that, what Jessica shared, is that even like people like settlement workers in schools, you know, many people like that needed help to support the Roma community. They've also have experience being turned away from like Hungarian Cultural Center and organizations like that.
So I see there's two more
Can I
questions.
say one thing, sorry, with regarding that, if possible? I mean, I think this is one of the most interesting things in the findings, is this notion also, when we think about racism, we can think of it in a monolithic kind of way, but there's the racism that gets imported, you know, from folks who are coming from places where, you know, where there is a larger Roma population, or the racism with Roma is more overt, but that now are in positions of power here in Canada, right? So, because now they are the translators, now they are the doctors, now they are the lawyers because of language, right? In that kind of sense. And that kind of imported racism is often under-recognized by Canadians who aren't even seeing this happen, right? They're like, oh, you speak Hungarian, you speak Hungarian, you speak Czech, you speak Czech, you speak Bosnian, you speak Bosnian. Great. Not recognizing that there's those kind of dynamics that are taking place. So just really showing that what the experience of non-European and non-Roma folks see is very different than what's being experienced by Roma or folks who are from Europe originally here.
Thank you. So maybe I see two more questions there, and then we can take final question from here and wrap it up. Okay. Yeah, so. Yeah, I don't know your name, IG.
I just first I want to say hi, Gina.
Hi, LD.
And hi, Yutika and everyone. I wanted to actually give kudos because Gina and Cynthia and a lot of people back in the Roma Community Center days established the youth outreach worker positions that I had the privilege of being in for 10 years. We did, or we continue to do these kind of presentations to many service providers, including in the Toronto District School Board, where we're continue to fight. For example, the translator that's still in the TDSB because his wife is a VP that has, and things like that. But it's unfortunately, we're fighting now because I left the role not too recently. They haven't been able to fill my position. there's one Roma worker in all of Toronto. She's running ragged because the funds and things like that are not there. So I did want to give kudos because I feel like that role has been a great asset to the community for sure.
Huge.
And I'm excited to read. I have a copy of the research. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I'd be curious to see what the Roma participants, their perception of the different discriminations and microaggressions in regards to their own, I guess, in terms of colorism and shadism and their proximity to whiteness. Because even in my studies, the people who can pass as white have a very different perception and experiences than some of us might have darker skin or look like a completely different culture altogether. So I wonder if that's something that you looked in the actual research, or maybe.
That's a great question, LD. And I realize, I mean, you sharing your personal story would be a bit of a testament to that, right? Because a white passing Romani person who may be racially mixed is going to have a different experience than someone that is more identifiable as belonging to the BIPOC community, like yourself, right? So, yeah, Ildi was the first ever Roma youth outreach worker in Canada provided by the Ontario provincial government. So that was a big thing to hold on and such an asset for our community. Thank you.
And I see Jennifer.
Jen, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Still muted.
You're muted, Jennifer.
I can, how can I? I can hear with the mouse because it's not left-handed, so I cannot.
It looks like she's talking.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe should figure it out in the meantime. Any question from here?
Wait,
Any
Magda,
question?
were you going to say something about the shadism? You seem to be nodding a lot.
I mean, yes, and I'm happy to, just give space to the Romani Canadians here. I'm more curious about them, but I think that to your point, Ildi, one thing that I would say is that indeed many of the respondents that Gina and our friends talked to, they mentioned the fact that, for instance, some of them would be more white looking and make their way into stores and get housing and all that easily, as opposed to their siblings or mothers or fathers, someone in the family. And I think that for the audience is, I hope it's clear enough that as any other ethnic group, as any other racialized group, and so on, the Romani people are very diverse, not only in terms of language and religion, but also in terms of our, cultural and physical traits. So I think definitely colorism plays a role also, I think, inside our community, but probably is not the time for that here. Maybe just one point about activism. I think there was someone from the room talking about that. I would just add a piece about Europe, where I had done quite a bit of activism back in the days. And say that to a large extent, and probably building on Shayna's point that, this is not a monolithical, experience. To a large extent, the Roma organizations and the movement that we've seen in Europe has followed a similar path to other human rights organizations and movements in Europe. I'm talking about the feminist movement, the LGBTQ+ movement, and so on. So at the beginning of the 1990s, we all just jump into this American style of human rights monitoring, documenting, strategic litigation, bringing cases to court, changing policies. But then while the funding was taken away from by these foundations, I think that the shift is a little bit different, and I would not say that we are, you know, a movement as I would want us to be. I think we are talking more about a bunch of Roma organizations here and there, but we are not where we were in the 90s. We have many more policy documents about Roma people, many more scholars from the community talking about our issues. We are at the table and we demand more. So we demand to be at the table than we are. So, you know, things are changing, but progress is slow. And sometimes we go a step forward and then 20 steps back. And we see this not only in the case of the Roma people, but we see it in the United States now when we are like 100 years ago.
Thank you. Jennifer, can we hear you now?
Oh, yes, we can. Oh, sorry, I had to set my Zoom settings to unmute. So I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Jen. I'm Gina's cousin. So our mothers are my mother's passed away, but they were sisters. And so we have the same grandparents. But I just wanted to speak to the idea that in Canada that there's almost a systematic erasure. Like I'm very white passing, and I've had experiences where I've been asked in like even my master's degree, like, why do you care about BIPOC issues, or why is this important to you? But we have a complicated family history, but I wanted to kind of get to know what it meant to be a Hungarian Romani. And so I went to Hungary to go experience that. And I volunteered in a high school in Cegléd in Hungary. And I couldn't, for me to see the direct, explicit discrimination of Roma students in that high school, to the English teacher saying, they're dumb and lazy, it's in their genetics. It blew me away. And I had used my white passing privilege, I hadn't identified. And the next day, there was a girl in her class who raised her hand and said, I'm Romani. And I said, me too. And everybody just looked shocked. And this teacher looked shocked as well after she said these things to me that seemed so horrific, but these students were always used to. And then also the systemic discrimination that the white passing students or the non-Romani students receive better education, more like help, and and so I think in Canadian society we don't see those overt direct things, and I think that like our family, we don't get involved enough, even though we should, and we should care about these things. And so it's understanding those experiences that are really difficult and hard to, but that's the experience of our people, and that matters, and that's part of my ancestors, right? Like, and Gina's ancestors and all of our ancestors. And so yeah, I just wanted to share that because I thought that for me was a really big wake-up call, and I never knew that myself. So thank you, and thank you, Gina, for sharing. I'm so proud of you.
Jen, I'm so happy you joined us and shared your story.
Thank you. Do you have any final questions, anyone?
Yeah, so I first of all really appreciate you sharing the experiences of Roma people, as well as talking about the different forms of oppression that they face and the ways to support them in sharing their lived experiences. I feel like those are all really important pieces, and I feel like I learned a lot today, so thank you so much for that. And I was thinking, because I'm a high school teacher, I was thinking about like these issues within the context of high school.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about, well, I was going to ask you if you've had opportunities to teach about the experiences of Roma people in high school, and if there's been any pushback from parents in teaching about Roma people, and if so, how you might have addressed that. So that was my first question. And then I also had a question about the experiences of Roma students and how educators can support those students in feeling comfortable with sharing their experiences instead of feeling the need to suppress different parts of their identity. So those were the two questions that I was kind of grappling with and thinking about.
Such important questions. Well, I'll begin by saying, throughout my entire university career at University of Toronto, my undergrad, my grad degree, I've never met another Romani student. I've never met a Romani teacher. I hardly ever meet other Romani people in Canada. It feels very alone and isolating. That's one thing I didn't mention actually in the findings, is that we all feel very isolated and alone because we don't see or know other people like us. And so we also, and in that, you know, for me teaching, I'm also a high school teacher, you know, I try to share who I am and my experiences with my students, and I see it just goes right over their head sometimes. Like the gypsy stereotype is just so deeply entrenched and embedded that the other story, our story, is so hard for them to grapple with, and it'll take more concentrated, focused, direct teaching about that. So even when I try to share, you know, my grandparents from Hungary were Holocaust survivors, even that is over people's heads sometimes. They're like, what? They've never heard about that. I mean, again, we're forced to say gypsy because when you say Roma, they're like, what's that? Are you from Italy? Are you from Romania? So we're forced to identify as gypsy, right? And when you start doing that, it opens up a Pandora's box of things that, you know, there's a disconnect between the fantasy and the stereotypes and the reality. So there's a lot that has to go on with that. So teaching about the Roma experience from a perspective as a teacher, I try to insert it here and there where I can to give at least my own students and also my colleagues, trying to teach my colleagues, like I shared this presentation today in the Teams channel, that in case anyone's interested in learning more, here's the link to the SFU presentation. Like, I know that even with teacher colleagues, and if I identify my background, I get comments like, oh, that's so cool, you know, and as soon as I hear that, right away, I get that cringe in my stomach. I'm like, no, it's not so cool. It's no more cooler than to be Chinese or Italian or Indian or anything, right? There's nothing cool, right? Or I love traveling. I'm still hearing this from people with 1 or 2 degrees. And I'm like, come on, no, okay? And then from the experience, there's never been pushback that I've received. Now, working with Roma students in public schools, and I did that in Toronto a lot. I had a great opportunity through the TDSB, and you know, when I was in Teachers College at OISE, and I did a whole like month-long internship with the equity department at the TDSB. And so in one high school in Parkdale, there was 200 Hungarian Roma students, and there they don't have integrated ESL. It's like separate classrooms, right? So students were feeling that same experience of being segregated as they were in schools in Hungary. There's a lot of issues that have ongoing segregation in education, right? Throughout Central and Eastern Europe. So they were feeling segregated in these ESL classrooms. Again, the interpreters, I mean, the principal of the school was a Ukrainian Canadian, and I so much bias I had to deal with even interacting with her. The interpreters in the school, like a lot of stuff going on. So there's been some amazing teachers that have tried to connect with the Roma Community Center and learn about Roma culture, you know, and learn about, you know, the challenges and how to help support their students. And that's been wonderful, you know, seeing teachers that make the effort. And there was actually a little film that was made by Roma students at Parkdale Collegiate in Toronto that shared their experience of the Holocaust. Because they got to share their family's experience in this 3-minute like video, and it was really, really powerful, and it was facilitated by the film studies teacher. So when the student, and there's another experience by OISE that facilitated a whole theater piece, like a theater of the oppressed pedagogy piece, where they got to share their experiences being in school in Hungary and all the physical and psychological abuse that they went through by teachers. So there was, you know, me growing up in Canada, I've had so much privilege of like being born in this country. And when I go to Hungary and I experience what my family experiences there, and I get to also experience it once I'm identified, because I'm white passing as well, right? And like, so I get different and much better treatment until I'm with my community and with my family. And then things change drastically, right? The hate look, the disgust gaze becomes very apparent. So yeah, it's there's a lot. I hope I answered your question in the middle of all that.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, thank you so much. That was very helpful. I really appreciate you sharing your own experiences. Yeah.
Great. So I want to say thank you so much for all of you and for, you know, talking to us, sharing those stories, knowledge. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to send you over the link of the recording so you can share. That'd be great. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Great.
you. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to work with Magda and Gina. And Lilach, I'll share with you. I'll let you know when the piece comes out. As well. It'll be out published probably April 7th, so that it can be promoted on April 8th.
Let us all know.
Will do.
Thank you. I will. And
Thank
if you want to see more resources, if you go to the Canadian Romani Alliance website, we have like tons of articles. We have the Harvard research study final report. So, and yeah, there are books as well that are on there, some recommendations. It's for you to learn more if you like. And if you ever want any teaching resources, you could also contact me as well.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.